Henry Wiencek and I share a biographical detail. Each of us went to a Jesuit high school in St. Louis and in Boston, respectively, he being the native Bostonian. Whether that background has anything to do with the iconoclastic nature of Wiencek's most recent book, I'm not sure, but iconoclastic it certainly is. I'm talking about Master of the Mountain, which has just come out in paperback. And I don't think I can do any better than to quote my colleague Jonathan Yardley, who placed the book on his best books of 2012 list. A description of the book and the controversy that it set off. Quote, "A fine book that fits no precise category is Master of the Mountain, Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves, Henry Wiencek's devastating picture of the slaveocracy maintained by the author of the Declaration of Independence at his plantations at Monticello and elsewhere. The complexities of race in America have preoccupied Wiencek for years and have now produced 3 exceptional books. The others are The Hairstons, An American Family in Black and White, and An Imperfect God, George Washington, His Slaves, and the Creation of America, of which this may be the best. Wiencek goes beyond the much-told story of Jefferson and Sally Hemings to leave no doubt that given the choice between the economic well-being of his holdings and the rights of the enslaved people who kept them humming, the slaves did not come first. It is not a pretty story, but Wiencek tells it very well. I might add that the Jeffersonian establishment has taken issue, to put it mildly, with Wiencek's take on their man. For The Hairstons, Wiencek won a National Book Critics Circle Award, and for An Imperfect God, he won a Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He lives and works as an independent scholar in a place where Thomas Jefferson has a stronger presence than perhaps anywhere but Monticello itself, and that is Charlottesville, Virginia. Please welcome Henry Wiencek.
Thank you very much, Dennis. The Jesuits certainly did have an effect on me, and I think that one of the things that they gave me was something that stood me in good stead doing my George Washington book and Jefferson book, is that to take a careful look at the text. Go back to the original documents, look at them yourself, line by line, word by word, and see what has been left out. See if somebody else who purports to be an expert has twisted, elided, omitted, or in some way distorted what the original says. And that was actually the path that I took in writing the Jefferson book, which turned out to be a very different creature from what I thought it would be. No one wants to write a book that is perceived as iconoclastic about Mr. Jefferson living in Mr. Jefferson's town. But believe me, it's true. I didn't start out wanting to do a book on Jefferson at all. It was suggested to me by a librarian, and I was at a conference in Richmond, and one of the librarians said, you should do a book on Jefferson, because I was talking about all the new information that had turned up when I was writing about George Washington. And it didn't take me but the hour and 10 minutes between Richmond and Charlottesville to decide that I would make that my next project, because there was so much about Jefferson that I didn't understand. I didn't understand, for example, how he could have a mixed-race lover and mixed-race children and then continue to say and do the things that he did to black people. I didn't understand the so-called paradox about him, that on the one hand he could write the Declaration of Independence and then continue to hold slaves. But at the time, I was content to let it stay at that stage of paradox. Everybody said that he was a man of contradictions and a man of great complexities. And I knew all of the major historians at UVA and Monticello who had spent their lives and careers studying Jefferson. I'd lived in Monticello since 1992. And I fully accepted their view of Jefferson, that he was a very highly moral and very conflicted man on the subject of slavery, that he yearned to throw it off, but he could not, because he was hampered by his terrible burdensome debts, and he was also hampered by a primitive racism that was typical of many 18th century people. He simply thought that black people were inferior and that he could never throw off this idea. And also that he was hampered by political considerations, but that on the other side of all of that, he treated his slaves very well, and he yearned to find an opportunity somehow to free them. Well, I spent about 2 years researching and writing a book that was really very much along those lines when things began to fall apart. As the Jesuits had taught me, I spent a lot of time looking at the original documents, some of which are at the Library of Congress and were available online on the internet. And what I began to find really disturbed me. For one thing, one of the first things I found was a document that showed that the regime at Monticello was not as benevolent and as kind as we had been led to believe. That I found a note about the young boys being whipped to get them to work in Mr. Jefferson's nail factory at the top of the mountain. Now, this line had been deliberately omitted when that letter was first published in 1953 by Monticello, and in an edition prepared by a UVA editor. When it was initially published, the last line was just 3 dots. No one is being whipped, ... Well, when the full text was published in 2005, it turned out to say no one is being whipped except the small ones. Now, this changes the meaning of the letter 100%. No one's being whipped except the children to get them to work. And the head historian at Monticello, who has been basing all of her research on this letter, did not know that until I mentioned it in a public talk in Charlottesville. And I discovered that much of the writing about Jefferson's regime was based on this one letter, which was sanitized. But what really shook my thinking about Jefferson and brought me into very sharp conflict with the Jefferson establishment was my discovery of two letters that were actually in plain sight. They weren't something they weren't items that were buried in boxes somewhere and had to be dug out. They had been published. They should have been known. They should have been written about, but they weren't. In one of them, in the 1790s, early 1790s, Jefferson was writing a profit and loss memo about his plantation to George Washington, of all people, who was laying plans to free his slaves. And Jefferson said that the increase in the slave population was part of the profit. He said, I allow nothing for losses by death, but I will take credit 4% per annum for their increase in keeping up their own numbers. Now, this was an extraordinary formula. I hadn't seen anyone else state this so bluntly. He was literally counting the babies at Monticello and calculating how much they increased every year, and he put it down in the profit column of the plantation. And at first I thought, well, this might just be an outlier. Maybe it doesn't really mean what I think it means. But 2 years later, he wrote a letter to a neighboring family and said, if you've got any money, invest it in slaves. He was advancing the idea of slavery as the strategic investment strategy of the future. He said slave property increases from 5 to 10% a year. He called it the silent profit. And I began to see in Jefferson's thinking something that George Washington had railed against. It was this notion of turning people into money. Because once you turn a person into money, into a commodity, you can do anything. You turn them into a non-being. And Jefferson had done that, and it coincided in the 1790s with a marked decline in his statements about emancipation. Because the young Jefferson had been a very, very fiery emancipator. In the 1760s, he proposed an emancipation bill that failed to get passed in the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And before he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote a political manifesto calling for the enfranchisement of the slaves in Virginia. Now, enfranchisement is a legal term that means to give the rights of citizenship to. This was in 1774, in the run-up to the Revolution. If we had actually done something like that, it would have changed our history. Now, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, just 2 years after he talked about enfranchisement and wrote that all men are created equal, I fully believe that he meant to include African Americans in that formula. And other